Hey guys, Woods Farm here. Finally back out working on the Kubelwagen. Finally had a chance to get it in the garage, and the weather's pretty crappy outside, so I've got a chance to work on it. Gonna work on some of the wiring, and there's also some mechanical stuff that I want to work on, and this is just in an effort to get it more operational. Last time I left off, there was a lot of odds and ends that needed to be done, and I kind of brushed over a lot of things. So for starters, headlights. Going to go back and revisit the wiring, starting with the headlights. Obviously I got to move on to brake lights, signal lights, that kind of stuff, but I'm going to start with the headlights because back in the summer I actually had it at a reenactment event, and I drove out somewhere and I got distracted and it got dark, and I went to drive it back to camp and I had no headlights, which I knew but I'd kind of forgotten about at the time, so I had to like drive with a flashlight, and it wasn't the best. So definitely want to get some headlights working. And there's one of the big jobs I'm going to work on this winter is I'm going to try to increase the ride height. Obviously, it squatted down a little more than I wanted, and it's pretty much bottoming out if you get a couple of guys in the back. And I also forgot to add the bump stops, so that wasn't really good for it. I mean, I haven't driven it a lot, but I want to work on the torsion bars and do that job, adjust it so that hopefully I can increase the ride height a little bit, and I might actually upgrade to some coilovers for the back shocks. So that's something I'm going to be working on. And actually, the generator is not working. Let's get some light in here. It was working briefly. It's got a new set of brushes in it, and I originally did all the troubleshooting, and that led me to the voltage regulator, which I replaced. And after I did that, I was charging. I had 14 volts at the battery, all was good. Drove it around for a little bit. The generator light came on the dash, and right back to not charging. This time I did all the troubleshooting and found that it won't actually polarize and spin if you put power to the, I guess it's the D plus, and ground it out. It should spin in reverse, and it won't do that. That's an indication that there's a bearing problem or maybe a short inside. So I have to deal with that. It's kind of important because once I get the headlights and a lot of the other electrical going, I'm not really going to be able to drive this around without killing the battery. So that's something that's on the to-do list. And then another thing is, I never got around to finishing the gasket around the engine tin. And that is pretty important because as it sits idling, it actually has a tendency to draw warm air up and recycle it back over top of the engine. And what you want is you want the engine compartment sealed so that it is bringing fresh air in through the vents, and the fan shroud is pulling that fresh air in and forcing it over the engine. So to do that, I got to seal this off. I have a couple ideas how I'm going to do that. I'm just going to get some sort of rubber gasket type material and screw it to the sheet metal here and kind of cover up that space. So that's one of the things I want to do before I really put a lot of hours on this engine. I want to make sure it's not overheating. So yeah, that's a nightmare of a rat's nest of wiring. I'm not the best at this. It's my first vehicle. I had a really solid plan. I've got a bunch of diagrams that I drew out. The problem is I did this last winter as kind of the starting point to the wiring. So now I'm going back and I'm scratching my head. You know, it's been several months and I'm trying to kind of look at my diagrams and look at this and kind of figure out everything. Luckily I had the diagrams that I went by, that I created, so it's not actually that difficult to figure it out. You know, I did some tidying up in here. There's some zip ties and stuff, but it's pretty ratty, so I hope to maybe clean it up as well, get it a little neater. But the main thing is working on the headlight switch, the dimmer switch to control the headlights. So that's what I'm gonna start doing now. These are my lights. I already have a lot of stuff wired. Like, I have a lot of wire in the vehicle. I did that kind of pre-painting. So I got the wires here. That's a ground that just goes straight to the chassis. And then these 3 wires, the 2 heavy duty, the red and the blue, are for the high and low beam, and the yellow is the signal light. And these run back. They're already all tied in, and they run back through here, through the firewall, and up behind where the dash is. So what needs to happen here is I need to drill an actual second hole through the fender, and then this wiring harness goes up through the fender and then into a hole in the back of this light housing. And then I have to wire some connectors onto these guys and hook it up to the actual light. Okay, there's one of the wiring diagrams I created. It's just kind of the rough plan of how I had the fuse boxes and the relays set up. I'm also using these diagrams as a rough guide that I got off the internet, off of a hot rod website. These are helpful too. It's very basic. So this is just how my main power flows with the ignition switch, and I've got some of this lines kind of planned out of what's going to go off of what fuse box. So luckily I had this, because that wiring would have made no sense without something to reference back to. Okay, so for the high beams, I'm going to use one of these floor button switches. So I have to, that's the other thing, I got to kind of wire this in so that it draws power and goes to a relay, which will then trigger the main power going to the high beam. Okay, so I finished the main headlight circuit, and I have the driver's side headlight actually hooked up so I can test everything. So the main switch there's on the dash initiates the low beam, and then the floor switch adds the high beam. And I have it set up so that it's hard to get to the switch here because the dash is folded down, but I'll show you. So you add the switch, and then you hit your sets. High beam's off, high beam's on, and then kill the main lights. And there you go. So now all I have to do is just basically connect the headlight on the passenger side, and that's completely done. I do want to go back and try to clean this up. The main wiring harness that comes in from the headlights, I think it's about 6 or 8 inches too long. There's just a lot of extra wire. So I can always go back and remove that. And I think that's really what I need to do with this whole area, is just kind of retrace my steps, and any of the wires I can kind of shorten up. I can do that later, and just kind of maybe start zip tying some of them into bundles and just try to get everything organized. But from here, I think I'm just going to call it a night. But when it comes to wiring, the next thing I'm going to look at is the brake lights. Brake light, tail lights, and also the last thing I'll probably work on is the signal lights flasher sort of system. Right now I have the headlights set up so they work with the ignition key off. You know, if you needed lights or something like that, you don't have to worry about throwing on the ignition and you know, potentially burning out the points, or you know, having power going back to the engine. It's its own separate switch and system, and it's always live. I figured that was the easiest way to rig it up. My ignition switch, it doesn't have an accessory mode. It just basically is the ignition and powers up everything related to the engine. Some of the lighting circuits I will probably have set up where it's a ignition switch on only, so they'll run off of this fuse box. Or sorry, this fuse box here is power all the time, and then the top one is ignition switch on only. That's how I have it separated. So, okay, it's next morning. Got a little bit of time to work on the Kubel. I'd really like to start doing some electrical again and maybe work on the tail lights, but I don't have time to get into that today. So I'm just going to put those bump stops in. That way when I'm doing like test drives and stuff, I'm not totally bottoming out the suspension. I should have put those in a long time ago. And I'm also going to take a look at the torsion bar system and see what actually needs to happen there for me to deal with that. So the problem was the original style of bump stops for the Kubelwagen, or I should say the Thing, there was an integrated kind of spot where the rubber piece would kind of clip over top of. Well, that was all rusted out. So I looked online and there was kind of like, I found these things. I would have preferred if they were black, but these kind of have a bolt point. And so I'm going to be able to attach these a lot easier than you know, a stock setup. The stock ones are a little bit bigger, but this is better than nothing. So here's the spot where the bump stop would be normally mounted, and normally there was like kind of this protrusion that came up and the rubber would just kind of fit over top of it and hold on by pressure. But that was all rusted away, so I ground it all out, and unfortunately that hole's a tad offset, but the idea is to bolt on the new bump stop. So this is just a temporary fix. Like I said, those are quite a bit smaller, so I'm thinking I might actually have to like weld on an adapter or something, or maybe find a different part. So the other thing I want to do this winter, and I'm probably not going to get to it in this video, is I have to deal with the torsion bar, because what I want to do is I actually made a mistake. It was just an oversight. I built the fender and positioned the fender and the bodywork back here all based on having the engine out of the car, and obviously when I threw the engine in, it sagged a lot more than I thought it would, and I wasn't expecting it, and it changed kind of how much clearance you have from the top of the fender to the tire. So I think I can correct this by adjusting the torsion suspension. There's a torsion bar in here, and you can lower this control arm. You can adjust it. Most guys, if you go online, there's tutorials, most guys are actually lowering it to get a lower ride height on like Beetles and stuff for hot rodding. I want to do the opposite. I want to raise it. Okay, so here's the issue. I was watching some videos online, doing a bit of research. Initially, I thought that I could actually raise the ride height by adjusting the torsion bars and the control arm. And there's lots of information online about lowering it, which you can be done. You know, if you're doing like a hot rod application or something. But I didn't see any videos about raising it, and then I realized that there's a stop plate here, and right, because it's under tension, that keeps it from just springing out, right? So I think what my problem is that there's just a little bit too much weight in the back, and it's maybe the torsion bars are a bit old, but I think it's sagging or just kind of compressing a little bit too much without any kind of actual weight in the back. So I'm actually going to throw the tire on at some point, pull the jack, and now that I have a chalk line here, I can see if it actually compresses just under the weight of the engine and the body of the car. If it does, I think I might be able to still monkey around with the torsion bar and set it up so there's more pressure, so it takes more force to compress it. So I'm going to see if that's an option. I also noticed that a few places online actually have heavier torsion bars for what they call off-road applications. So down the road that might be an option just to kind of stiffen up the back end. Another option is to deal with the shock absorber, maybe do a coil over, see if that helps keep it from compressing. So that's what I'm looking at. But right now I'm going to deal with this bump stop issue. Like I mentioned earlier, this piece was all rusted out, and there's no actual piece to mount the stock stop on there. It's basically just like a rubber pad, and this part here, it keeps the whole thing from compressing too much, from like bottoming out your suspension.